It says it's starting. Oh, okay. I can't do a DPR Jones voice, but welcome to another exciting edition of the Supernatural Science Salad Show. We've got a few regulars here, I suppose, and Joyce was in a few of the other episodes, and Rose was in the pilot episode, if you can call it that. And Prudent has also joined us, and he's the owner of the Ode to Discord show
Dialogue.
series. Ode to Dialogue series, my apologies. Anyway, the itinerary for today is to roughly cover some of the same topics in the Magic Sandwich show. So we're going to start off with abiogenesis, then move on to logic, and then if there's time, maybe do something on the Ukraine crisis because it's important. So we start on abiogenesis. What do people think about that? Do you think abiogenesis is reasonable? Is it reasonable to suggest that life can come from non-life, or is it satanic delusion?
I think there's essentially a lot of data out there that tends to support towards the abiogenesis theory. Granted, it's not as well supported, obviously, as evolution, but I think there was an experiment. I forgot the scientist's name. I can look it up. I think it was back in 2009. This won a Nobel Prize. It was Dr. Jack Shostak, and what he did was he actually developed, I think, like a model that essentially shows how you can essentially have biological life appear, which basically it's kind of a complicated process. You have certain elements come into like a phospholipid bilayer, and what they do is once you have those elements in, there's a point where the elements within the bilayer can actually leach away from other resources, from other materials, which that's essentially the start of competition. So once life originates, that gives us a good model to know like when evolution then will occur, because they're not, abiogenesis and evolution are not necessarily the same thing as some creationists would have us believe, but it's rather more, they're separate things, but one inevitably does lead to the other, because essentially with evolution, once life originates, competition and competition for resources is just the natural order. So really, to that sense, I can sort of see like where the two things like abiogenesis and evolution, they essentially do link together, only with the respect that one leads to another.
Yeah, my understanding. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Quantum.
No, sorry. You go ahead first. It's fine.
I was just going to say my understanding was, as far as like the most commonly accepted model was essentially, or is essentially, Big Bang followed by abiogenesis, which would spawn the first, say, single-celled organisms, followed by evolution to bring us where we are now.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think abiogenesis is looked at entirely in the "this happened millions of years ago" category.
So would people like creationists have a harder time accepting something like abiogenesis rather than evolution?
I think because I think many a creationist has a problem with the anything that isn't simple and concrete, like trouble thinking in the abstract to a degree. I help run or help admin a Facebook page for Alaskan atheists, and we've had hoax busters for God. That's what they're called. I would say they're trolling us, but I really don't think trolls are quite as dumb as these folks seem, and they keep coming back to like how stars are formed essentially, and they're, no matter what information we give them, right? Like, here, learn. You're saying you want to learn, so here, learn.
Well, there's probably a reason.
Links.
There's a reason for that, and it's when you talk with several creationists, they seem to have this notion that the Bible is the standard. If it doesn't fit, if reality doesn't fit, with their preconceived notion, then reality is wrong. Whereas, with people like us, we probably more think the other way around, where it's like, look, if this particular passage, like in your book, isn't concordant, with the predictive models that we've made so far, at least currently, then there really isn't much of a reason to take some of these passages, or most of these passages, literally. And I think that's the main difference, I think. And that's why it becomes so difficult to talk with certain people who hold those views.
Oh yeah, I think the trouble with whoever is posting for Hoaxbusters for God, I think their trouble is contemplating, gravity in a vacuum. Essentially, they're like, but you can't compress a gas without a container, is what they keep saying. And God created all the stars and knows them all by name, I think, is what keeps getting quoted at me. Every single one, he ends with this exclamation point.
Wait, he knows all the names. I thought humans were the ones who named all of them. Like, all of a sudden they're saying, God knew all the stars
I don't
before
know.
they were even named. It seems a little... It's kind of a bit vague, or a bit bold to say.
Yeah, I think the quote is literally, God created all the stars in the heavens and knows them all by name. Or calls them all by name, I can't recall.
So has there ever actually, because I hear a lot of Christians saying things like there's never been an instance where this sort of thing can happen, or scientists have never managed to create life or non-life. All they've done is synthesize amino acids. I'm not convinced. Is that true? Or
Well, we've seen molecules become, more complex and build up to that. That's the main reason. Again, I don't know much about abiogenesis, so if anyone might want to correct me, but essentially, this ever-increasing complexity that we see with molecules, in which they essentially can create at least elements that we know that are useful in life. Not elements like chemical elements, but important important chemical functions that. So, and essentially the idea is, all of the, if you have, X, Y, and Z, in one test tube that you can create, which X, Y, and Z are important in functioning for human life, then that just gives better reason to think that, yeah, it is possible. And again, I'm not totally sold, on abiogenesis fully yet, but I think there is some pretty good data to support it right now. So right now, yeah, I do believe, obviously, in abiogenesis now, but I do want to be careful, not to get a little too overconfident. I want to wait maybe a few more years down the road when more data comes in, because again, the evidence for abiogenesis just isn't as strong, as evolution. So yeah, that's the main thing I try to keep weary about, at least.
Yeah, I got 2 points about that. Number one, that the argument that scientists haven't made life. I think it's a little strange because that's not abiogenesis. Abiogenesis, that life arose from natural processes, so it doesn't really matter whether or not we can create life. That's not mean. I don't see the the literal connection between, oh, if we can make life, therefore life spontaneously arose. But about abiogenesis, I don't know. I'm okay with just saying I don't know. So yeah, I think it's possible that life can arise, but I really don't know actually.
Yeah, because again, I mean, obviously when this is the favorite, creationist word game where they like to link, the Big Bang, abiogenesis, and, evolution all into the same pot when really no, they're all separate, they're all separate. And what irritates me, is every time I have to try to explain that, and it seems like it doesn't matter how many times you tell them, they're still going to play this semantic game, and you just kind of have to ignore them. I mean, with evolution, which occurs, after abiogenesis, like the third step, you can clearly, it's not too hard for me because I am a biology major. I can sort of explain, the divergence of life on the tree of life, how things change, diverge, and mutate, and are non-randomly selected by ecological processes. I mean, I can try to fit that in and make it as easy to understand as possible, but even when I try to explain it, I realize, like, yeah, it is kind of, there's a lot you have to kind of go over. It's hard to kind of compress evolution and make it very simple for those, who do have difficulty understanding it. And certainly the same can be said for abiogenesis.
Well, I think the main concept of evolution is really elegant and really easy to understand, but
Well, yeah,
so
but now when you try to go into the specifics.
yeah, no, that's what I'm going to say. The main idea is most people understand, but then they don't really see how it is applied in nature. But yeah.
Do you think that the concept of abiogenesis is more threatening to something like a theistic worldview than the concept of evolution?
Yeah, I've actually thought about this one. I think it kind of is. I mean, not necessarily. I mean, certainly. I mean, yeah, you can be a theist and believe in abiogenesis as well as evolution, but abiogenesis seems to be a larger stake into the heart, just because it really shows I mean, evolution only explains how life diverges, but that obviously it does really take away, I guess, the usefulness of a creator, at least for the purpose of just life itself. And if you can, if you have a chemical model that shows how it really can happen, where you can see life arise from non-life, that's a very difficult concept. I think that many will have trouble accepting.
So it's almost a god of the gaps.
I also think.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Well, I think if abiogenesis is possible and somewhat proven, and how far is that possible, I think it also opens the possibility of life on other planets and other galaxies, and that renders us, the humans, even more insignificant than we are now. So maybe that's a problem for the theistic worldview.
Not all I think some theists are very okay with accepting that we humans as a whole are not that insignificant if you compare at least to the entire universe. At least several that I know. So it doesn't seem like I don't see that being too much of a problem.
So, I mean, I was going to say, sorry, that do you think this is a case of almost God of the gaps arguments? Because in terms of the things that we don't know yet, I suppose abiogenesis is one of those things that is not fully, we don't have a decent model for it. But I suppose the other main gap is the cosmological beginnings of the universe. But then I suppose that abiogenesis is likely to be solved fairly quickly. It's a possibility.
Maybe. I always kind of thought more along. I mean, even back in my theist days, I was fine with abiogenesis, evolution, everything. I was just okay. My thought process at that time was more, well, just go back to the very, very beginning. Not even before the Big Bang, possibly. Like, when does something like energy arise? And I guess when I kind of learned that it is very possible that energy itself could be infinite, then I think that was that's probably why I don't hold so much that worldview anymore. So again, I mean, I was when I had that, when I was a theist, I always knew that the scientific method was always the standard. I always kind of held to that, and I think that's probably if you are going to be one of those intelligent theists who hold that science is the standard, I think you eventually figure out that it's very, very difficult to hold on to a theistic worldview after that.
Does anyone else have anything to add? Because we can move on to the next topic if we feel this has been exhausted.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Oh, hello, Helena.
Hi.
I think your mic has been fixed now. Do you want to add anything about abiogenesis?
It is a little reverby for me, but I'm going to try to not listen to my own echo. No, just the only thing is, I don't have a problem. I really don't, and I think it's very useful to tell theists or anyone that the abiogenesis is a separate field. It's not the same as evolution. Evolution is about what happens once life is here. Abiogenesis is about trying to solve the mystery of how life came from non-life. The only thing is that once we figure out how life did come from non-life, well, then it's going to be added. It's part of evolution. So I'm not so sure we should really be all that insistent that they're separate fields. They're going to converge once we figure it out. That's all.
I mean, does anyone have any idea how long this is going to take? I mean, they said. Is that a no? I mean, they said was it that cold fusion? No, not cold fusion. Nuclear fusion, hot fusion, cold fusion, whatever was always 20 years away. So everyone always said that nuclear fusion is 20 years away, and then 20 years later they'd say the same thing, and it's never arrived, even now. Although that might be changing. What about abiogenesis? I mean, when do people think that we're going to come up with a unified mold for how life got here on Earth, or is it going to be something that we just don't have enough data to conclusively solve?
I think we're going to solve it, but I've been accused of having faith in science.
I think we're going to solve it, but I wouldn't know when. I think maybe you need a breakthrough to find it, but I wouldn't dare to say when.
I don't know, from my skimming of the Wikipedia article on the Miller-Urey experiments, it seems like we're pretty damn close to getting it figured out. They said something like 20 plus amino acid chains. More than 20 that naturally occur in life, and some that don't yet, or that we hadn't ever seen before. So, I don't know, it seems like it was rather successful for an early experiment, so it's possible we're very, very close.
Does anyone else have anything to add, or do you want to move on to another topic, because we're sort of half an hour in now anyway, so what's up to you lot? What do you want to do? Do you want to talk a little bit more about this, or move on to something else?
Well,
Let's move on.
Yeah.
The next topic on the itinerary was logic. I think in the Magic Sandwich, this was in the context of philosophy and the way that creationists use logic. Things I'm not very good at expressing it, but things like the law of non-contradiction and the laws of logic. And, could God, you know the sort of thing I'm referring to. I'm probably not very good at the best person to be saying this, but what do people have any thoughts on that?
Well, what creationists like to use is certain logical constructs, and then they try to prove a natural phenomenon or God with it. And I don't think that's the right application of logic. I think it's descriptive of our natural world. And I think it's a misapplication of trying to prove anything with it. And you have lots of those logical examples of all men have beards. Aristotle has a man. Aristotle has a beard. That sort of logical constructs which are logically consistent, but might not be true. And I think trying to prove anything in the real world with those kinds of constructs is a bit wasting your time.
Do people think that philosophy still has any validity in a world where we have modern science and an empirical way of thinking? Is philosophy obsolete, as Stephen Hawking might say?
I don't think it's obsolete. That's a huge question, and it's a philosophical question. So how is it obsolete when we have to use philosophy to figure out if philosophy is obsolete? How could philosophy possibly be obsolete?
I think Stephen Hawking said it in the sense that we use the scientific method today to empirically understand how the universe works. So I think the gist that he was getting at was that the scientific method is superior to all other sorts of methodology in learning about how the universe works. So it's sort of like we've reached a good philosophical model now, And I suppose he might suggest, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the possibility that maybe science can do everything that natural philosophy formerly could do. I mean, I suppose some people might suggest that that was a reasonable point of view.
No, I don't think so at all. Because when you get down to just pure science, nothing but science, then we're back to automatons and there is no good and there is no bad, and I don't think pure science works. Philosophy isn't trying to do the job science does. It never has. Well, perhaps it did a bit, but that was before science was really a thing. And now that we have science, then science does the figuring out of the how the universe works, and philosophy is more geared towards the whys of people and consciousness and pondering the questions that science really isn't designed to answer, the things that don't necessarily have answers.
Yeah, I think science is just objective, the making of predictable of models of prediction, and I think philosophy is still very useful in the subjective view of the world, in deciding what's good or bad, or just reasoning.
I think Ozzy's arrived now. We're talking about logic and philosophy. So at the moment, Stephen Hawking, I think, said fairly recently that he thought philosophy was obsolete as a subject. Would you agree with Stephen Hawking? I guess you wouldn't, but
I'm sorry. I feel like I've just come in late to the conversation, and I'm not sure what you're discussing about logic. And I'm also getting terrible feedback. Okay, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I think
I can.
Okay, good. Sorry, I was hearing dreadful feedback from someone. I'm not sure who. I didn't hear this conversation thus far. I've just got the invitation. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that the show was going on right now. It'd be best if either you filled me in on what you'd been discussing concerning logic, or else just proceed with the discussion, and I'll bring myself up to speed.
Okay. I think Stephen Hawking said, I don't know, he said a few months ago, and it might have even said it in one of his books, that he thought philosophy was obsolete, made obsolete by science, in the sense that science gives an empirical way of thinking, and philosophy is sort of a more archaic way of viewing things that was done hundreds of years ago, and now in the sense that we don't need philosophy as a subject because we have the scientific method, and there isn't a better method than science that we have.
Where is there a philosopher living anywhere who's trying to do cosmology?
I'm not too sure. I think it was. This was what Stephen Hawking said. I mean.
I think that his. Oh, sorry, Quantum. I wonder if you can mute yourself or something, or if you're not wearing earbuds or something. Thank you. My sense is that Stephen Hawking's knowledge, sort of his grasp of what philosophy consists of, is just about zero. I think he knows as much about philosophy as the average creationist knows about evolution, which is to say he has in his head a caricature of what philosophers do. When I was a philosophy grad student, I shared an office with someone who was working in philosophy of science. The department I was in was largely devoted to the philosophy of science. And the fellow I was sharing an office with at the time, he was interested in questions of cosmology. And he had an advanced degree in physics, and he had degrees in mathematics. And the people that I was studying philosophy of biology with had degrees in biology. This is someone like Daniel Dennett, who studies philosophy of mind and cognitive science, is absolutely up to date on the literature in what's going on in the cognitive sciences, the behavioral and brain sciences, the field of artificial intelligence. This idea that philosophers proceed the way someone like William Lane Craig does, who's really more of a theologian and an apologist than a proper philosopher. This idea that this is how philosophers proceed, they just sort of sit in their armchairs and think things through, is just a gross mischaracterization. Philosophers start with what evidence we have in hand, and it has always been so. It's easy to sort of get a mischaracterization of what philosophers do, because when you study philosophy, you usually study it historically to sort of study the ideas through history, and so you're always looking at what philosophers used to think. But I mean, look at someone like Descartes. Descartes described himself, self-identified as a physicist. That's what he called himself, a physicist. And he came up with sort of x and y coordinates that we learn in high school in mathematics. He was doing he had a theory of optics. He was dissecting eyeballs to understand optics and vision, things like that. I mean, this idea that philosophers just sit and reason, and what they do is uncoupled from what science has delivered to us, is completely unrealistic. This is a hysterical view of philosophy, and I think that someone like Stephen Hawking, for all of his brilliance, is at absolute ignoramus on the subject. I don't know what he thinks he knows, but I don't know any philosophers who are studying cosmology who think that they're doing something that replaces what cosmologists and physicists are doing, and that they're going to lead the physics and cosmology around and tell them, which theories are the right theories. That is not what philosophers of science are doing in these areas. That I think is laughable, and this kind of thing that those of us who are sort of science boosters, that kind of talk we kind of discredit ourselves when we engage in this. It leaves us open to charges of scientism, of sort of worshiping science and not bothering to consider what other domains are actually trying to do. That was a long answer.
Sorry, it's good. I mean, I sort of have two questions out of that. I'm just trying to remember what they were. I guess my first question is: do you think William Lane Craig is an ignoramus? Because I think he's claimed, in terms of H indices, I think he's supposed to be the fifth best philosopher in the world in terms of publications. Yet clearly William Lane Craig does exactly the sorts of things that you said that philosophers don't do, despite having all these publications. Second question, I guess, is that if you want to be a philosopher, do you have to decide quite early on what sort of philosopher you were going to be? I mean, for instance, if you're going to philosophize about the cosmology and the cause of the universe, I suspect that you'd have to get a decent background in cosmology to start off with. And
right. Well, let me take your second question first. Yeah, definitely. If you're going to study philosophy of mind, you'd better learn something about neurophysiology, and you'd better be studying latest computational theories in artificial intelligence and cognitive science. You'd better be studying what we know about language and the role that language plays in consciousness, and you have to sort of school yourself. And if you're going to be studying something like philosophical questions that arise in connection with cosmology and ultimate origins of the physical universe, you'd better go to school and start learning about what the physicists have discovered about this and what the competing theories are. Superstring theory. It's not my area. I'm not in a position to adjudicate on this. But yeah, that's minimally what you have to do. You simply can't do philosophy of a certain subject without schooling yourself on that subject. With respect to what you said about William Lane Craig, he's the fifth. What was that number? The fifth what?
I think Google used to, it was Microsoft actually. Microsoft used to have a search engine where you could. They've got rid of it now, and Google seems to have done something similar with its Google Scholar. But you used to have a search engine on it was called Microsoft Academic, and you could search through a database of publications made by scientists and prominent professors of other disciplines, and it would return an H index, which was an index used to measure the proficiency of an academic. I think effectively an H-index takes into account the number of publications someone's made, and as well as taking into account the number, it also takes into account how high impact the publications are in terms of citations. And I think the technical definition is the H-index is equal to the nth, the number of citations on the nth paper. So if you publish 6 papers, then you would look at the paper which has the mean number of citations, or something along those lines. And in terms of that value, William Lane Craig scored fifth in the world in terms of, on Microsoft Academic.
I find that wildly plausible. Just because there are people, I mean, someone like Daniel Dennett is going to score much higher than him simply because he's got his fingers in so many pies. Someone like Willard Van Orman Quine is just going to be absolutely godlike in the number of citations and references made to his work and the impact that he's had. I mean, William Lane Craig is going to be very relevant and important in areas of the philosophy of religion, that is, philosophers who are concerned with religious questions and with sort of old arguments about, well, the Kalam cosmological argument, for instance, and proofs of God, and those philosophers are interested in those particular questions. But I mean, you know, outside of that domain, I don't think he's going to be very, very well cited. Now, he's also done a lot of stuff, contributed a lot of stuff to the philosophy of time. That's an area I don't know anything about. So people who are interested in questions of the A theory of time versus the B theory of time, that sort of stuff, I'm sure that he's well cited there. But you know, to suggest that someone like William Lane Craig is sort of the 5th highest cited philosopher of all, that just seems incredible, literally incredible. I don't believe that. I think that's got to be wrong. Now, within a certain domain, within the philosophy of religion, I wouldn't have any doubt. He is a rock star. I mean, anybody, if you ask anybody who's religious, especially a Christian who's interested in apologetics, he's going to be the first name that comes up all the time. So he's big there. But outside of that, I'd never heard of him until I took, until I was teaching a course in philosophy of religion when I was a teaching assistant for a course on philosophy of religion. And then, then I found there was, an anthology where he was mentioned, and that was it. I'd never even heard his name before outside of that. And I was interested in epistemology. I was interested in philosophy of science. I was interested in philosophy of religion, philosophy of mind, not philosophy of religion, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language. Those were my areas. It was only when I became interested in philosophy of religion that I started encountering his name. And then, of course, he was everywhere. I couldn't get away from his name. He's absolutely everywhere.
Sorry, does anyone else want to say something? Because I've got a load of points I want to bring up. But I don't want to feel like I'm monopolising the conversation. Does anyone else want to say anything? Or are you having mic issues, Joyce? I think you might be muted.
Well, no, but I really don't know what to say actually. But yeah. Well, something about William Lane Craig that also always bugs me when I hear him is always he's a professional philosopher. I think that's a strange thing to say.
Well, he is a professional philosopher. I mean, he is in fact a professional philosopher. I don't think you can sort of take that away from him. I just don't think he's a good philosopher.
But that shows how much I know about the guy or philosophy. I mean, that's the only thing that always stands out to me. I mean, it's right what you say. But always sounds strange to me.
Well, could I say something else about William Lane Craig specifically? I just happened to be in a hangout yesterday where this very question came up. Someone was asking, what is your estimation of William Lane Craig as a philosopher? And it so happens that under a comment of a video I made, someone asked me the same thing, and so I typed it out. I wrote a comment, a reply in the comments. And I read that comment out yesterday on this hangout. And if you'll permit me, it's only 3 paragraphs. I'd like to read it here. It sort of sums up my view of William Lane Craig. Would that be okay?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, here's what I wrote. William Lane Craig is an intelligent and erudite man, but he represents, to my mind, some of the very worst tendencies that one could find in a philosopher. If philosophy is going to be worth anything, it has to be pursued as an open-ended and disinterested quest for understanding, with a view to producing a rational and coherent worldview, wherein one at least tries to follow where evidence and arguments lead. No one is without biases, but one must at least try to aim for this lofty goal. But William Lane Craig proceeds in reverse. He has pledged loyalty to a set of theological dogmas. His apologetical efforts consist of resuscitating long discredited philosophical arguments, misleading characterizations of scientific method, false presentations of historiographical principles of evidence, and his own philosophical work consists mostly of reverse-engineered premises and cynical appeals to people's pre-theoretical intuitions to arrive at his cherished dogmas. This is philosophy done backwards. It's an attempt to apply a veneer of intellectual respectability to the Christian articles of faith so that his fellow believers will be able to feel that their faith claims are somehow intellectually rigorous. A rearguard attempt to reassure the faithful that their religious beliefs are supported by science and history and philosophy. It's all done in service of belief maintenance and belief preservation. It's not open-minded inquiry. It's hard to look for truth when you think you already have it in your back pocket. And that, I think, is sort of probably the fairest characterization I can give of William Lane Craig. I don't think he's at all interested in finding the truth. He thinks he's got it all sewn up, and he's just busy confecting arguments to shore up his dogmas. And he appeals to popular intuitions, and that makes him enormously popular. But I mean, philosophers are not crawling out of the woodwork to sort of debunk him, and I mean, it'd be a waste of time, it'd be a waste of your sort of academic talents to do this kind of thing. In the same way that people are not coming out, biologists are not coming out in droves to argue with Ken Ham. Astronomers are not coming out in droves to debunk astrology. This has been done. Philosophers have debunked things like the Kalam cosmological argument. It's been set aside. It's still interesting as an exercise, as an intellectual exercise, and historically we want to sort of always revisit these arguments and understand them, to understand what people thought and why they thought them, and understand what's good and bad about an argument. But I mean, to suggest that something like the Kalam cosmological argument is the state of the art of philosophy on the subject is ludicrous. It's not.
I mean, the interesting thing though is that you said that people like biologists don't argue with Ken Ham, and astronomers don't argue with astrologers. But the difference is Ken Ham and the Flat Earth Society don't publish articles in research journals, whereas William Lane Craig does. And what I find really peculiar is that he's
what about someone like you, Ross?
Well, you do get you get the odd one. I mean, I'm reminded of Andrew Wakefield and his MMR vaccine controversy. I mean, okay, it does happen, but in terms of William Lane Craig, you've got a guy that clearly doesn't understand, that clearly misunderstands basic tenets of philosophy and science. I mean, someone that gets special relativity wrong is able to publish in high impact journals, and apparently, even if Microsoft Academic isn't a decent search engine, which I don't think it is actually, because the Microsoft Academic had loads of problems in the sense of its algorithms using to get the data. But even if that's a misleading situation, clearly William Lane Craig is still a high impact philosopher, making loads of very basic, all sorts of undergraduate level mistakes, and yet he is considered to be a really good philosopher among the religious community. And couldn't you even argue that someone like that, if you are religious and Christian like that, you've already made a mistake in philosophy, in that you are supporting an unsupportable viewpoint.
Well, I'm not sure what point you're making with the last question, but I mean William Lane Craig is going to be influential in religious circles, and even among philosophers of religion, because he does very, very clearly, very well articulate arguments in service of the conclusions that he's trying to get to. but so what? I mean, other philosophers that who do know something about these areas in cosmology are just not paying him much attention. They know he's getting this stuff wrong. They're not going to waste their time. When there is someone who's sort of working at the margins of a discipline, they will publish their papers, saying, yeah, this is wrong, he's getting this wrong, or they might even ignore him if they think he's really like some kind of wingnut on some particular question. That's what they'll do with anybody. And then you move on. Nobody is going, no philosopher is going to waste his philosophical career chasing someone like William Lane Craig any more than a biologist is going to sort of burn all his scholarly fuel chasing, Hugh Ross and trying to prove that his model of creationism is wrong. That's not going to. Nobody's going to do that. You're not going to waste your time as an academic doing this. So, I mean, that's why these people can get published in prestigious journals and do this. It says nothing wrong about the field. It's unfortunate, though, that there are people who are desperate for an apologetic, and they will latch on to someone like William Lane Craig and practically worship at his altar. But, I don't blame the field for that any more than I'm going to blame, the field of evolutionary biology and paleontologists and the fields of geology, because someone like Hugh Ross is able to get published in journals, and and that these disciplines are not devoting themselves to taking down this stuff. They don't take it seriously enough to waste much ink on it. And I don't know what else to add to that. But you had a question at the end there, Quantum, and I didn't quite catch what you were getting at.
In the sense that if you believe in God, you're already supporting the unsupportable. I mean, philosophy is supposed to be about the science of logic and understanding how logic works and interpretations of science, things like that. And if you're already supporting something that cannot be supported by the evidence, then doesn't that all by distantly make you a bad philosopher right from the off? And again, would be a sort of undergraduate level mistake.
No, I think that's putting it a little too strongly. I think that, well, first of all, philosophy isn't sort of just applies and uses logic, and it explores and tries to explicate logic and things like that. But I mean, it isn't philosophy, although it uses logic and uses and develops tools of critical thinking. It really is just sort of thinking about stuff using the best intellectual and analytical tools that we have at our disposal. It's not supposed to prejudge any particular question, right? So anybody can, put forward any hypothesis. It can be as sort of, madly speculative as you like, and it just has to explore it. So there's nothing wrong in principle with someone saying, well, let's imagine that there is a God. What can we work out from that? What would be implied from that? And stuff like that. I mean, that's okay. What I find particularly wrong about William Lane Craig is that he is presenting this stuff as if it was the sort of the state of the art of philosophy. That's what's wrong with it. But there's nothing wrong with being religious and being a philosopher. I mean, if you are, I mean, I think these people are mistaken. But I mean, is there anything wrong with being a scientist and being religious? I mean, you can be a scientist and be religious, right? So I think, yeah.
But I mean, I guess, sorry for continuing to speak, but I guess the point I was making is if you're a scientist and you're religious, let's say you're I don't know, an archaeologist, for instance, and actually that's probably a bad example. Let's say you're a chemist and your field is amino acids, for instance. You can be religious because it has absolutely nothing to do with the field of amino acids. You could study the properties of amino acids, how they work, how they interact, that sort of thing, and publish papers on it. It has nothing to do with religion. But then you have William Lane Craig, who is supposed to be a philosopher of religion, and yet, so that's essentially his field. So a better analogy would be a biologist that doesn't believe amino acids exist, that tries to study something related to them. I think that would probably be a better analogy. And we have William Lane Craig that is supposed to be a theological philosopher, that believes something that is unsupportable by the evidence. And I would argue that makes him automatically a bad philosopher. I don't know whether that's a decent enough point, but
yeah, I see your point now. Well, I mean, obviously he thinks the evidence does not point in the direction that you and I think it points, and that's okay. You just have to not have shabby arguments in defense of that. You know, and I think he has some pretty shabby arguments, and he appeals to intuition far too much, and that's what's wrong with it. It's not that. I mean, in principle, it's okay to have a kind of maverick view. That's perfectly okay. I don't see that as objectionable. The fact that he is sort of at odds with, you know, mainstream philosophy in this, that doesn't change anything. That doesn't matter. He's okay to proceed. I mean, there are people like, I think someone like Alvin Plantinga, I think, is, you know, so much better. You know, and I disagree with, you know, all of his theology. And I don't think that his, you know, arguments as proofs for God are any good. But I mean, he isn't sort of, you know, doing the kind of thing that William Lane Craig does, going around and, in my view, bamboozling people with a lot of bad philosophical arguments, and trying to sort of, you know, overwhelm people with his erudition, and you know, I don't see Alvin Plantinga doing that thing. Alvin Plantinga is someone who I think enjoys a much greater reputation among analytic philosophers, even though they don't agree with him on his theological views by and large. So I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with someone, you know, knowing all of the arguments in the sort of the domain of philosophy of religion and still concluding that there is a God. You know, obviously he's got reasons for thinking that there's a God, and he finds them convincing. I don't think he's insincere in his belief. I just think he's insincere in how convincing the arguments are that he's cooking up. And he's, you know, sort of busy trying to shore up some of these bad arguments and resuscitate a lot of old arguments that have been quite discredited. That, I think, is what's objectionable. It's not that he's come to some wrong conclusion. You can't fault someone, it seems to me, simply because they've come to some wrong conclusions. You know, all you can do is disagree with them, but that doesn't make them sort of bad at their field. I think what makes you bad at your field is not that you've come to some wrong conclusions, but that really that you're being irresponsible in how you practice it and perhaps misrepresentative, which I think William Lane Craig does. I don't challenge his sincerity, although I don't think he believes some of the arguments and apologetics he puts forward.
I think there's one thing that you keep coming back to, which to me is sort of could be recognized as praise, and I find it amusing, is that the one thing William Lane Craig seems to be absolutely exceptional, a master in his field at, is mental gymnastics to make whatever he can come up with fit what he wants it to fit. and I suppose a bit of praise should be offered there, because that is a pretty impressive feat, I think. Yeah, when one can convince themselves so fully of something that no matter what they see, the evidence fits. It's similar to you see Ken Ham and Ray Comfort doing.
Yeah, well, we all engage in motivated reasoning, right? You know, when we hold a position and someone, you know, raises an objection, we can almost always see what's wrong with it. Immediately, things that might be wrong with the objection spring to mind. But when someone comes along with an argument in favor of a view you already hold, it's almost impossible for you to see what might be wrong with it. You really kind of have to force yourself. You know, really what springs to mind immediately is how plausible it is, and all the good reasons you could offer, you know, to support that argument in support of your theory. And so that's natural. And the smarter you are, the better you are at this kind of rationalization. And I think there's no question that William Lane Craig is exquisitely intelligent. It's just that he's applying his intelligence in service of a set of conclusions. And that, I think, is unfortunate, because I think if there's anything you can sort of fault him for more than anything else, it's that a philosopher has to at least try not to be doing that. You know, has to sort of resist that mightily, and he seems to not resist it at all. He just seems to go headlong into it.
Now I wonder if William Lane Craig has is these two sides. The one side of which he bamboozles people with his logical arguments, which the philosophical community has already debunked or has objections to, and if he has a academic side, which with which he writes those papers, which he might gets lots of citations with. Or does he have that? Do you know that?
Oh yeah, I mean he has a very serious side. I mean the stuff that he writes, that he publishes in journals, is much more serious, much more rigorous. The stuff on his philosophy of time that he's written, his works in metaphysics there, I mean, I'm not even qualified to read and comment on it, so I don't. I mean, I would never impugn his abilities there. I don't think that, I'm not even qualified to remark on it. I assume that stuff is just fine. It's taken fairly seriously. Even if he has marginal views, I don't think that people would sort of malign his positions and arguments, even if they disagree with them. So, yeah, I mean, I guess there can be two sides here. Yeah, but I mean, people will say the same thing about a scientist. People will say the same thing about, Lawrence Krauss. I mean, Lawrence Krauss is a brilliant physicist. He's on the cutting edge of the field. He's made important contributions to the field of cosmology, and he's highly esteemed by his peers. And then he goes out and he has a whole bunch of really controversial views about atheism and religion. And he goes out there and he sometimes puts his foot in his mouth on some of these questions. And some people adore him for it, and some people revile him for it. But in any case, he's certainly stepping out of his own field of knowledge on some of these questions. And he there is relying on his prestige in one domain, and counting on that, so that people will sort of heed what the message of the atheism that he's propounding. And I mean, I think some people are right to fault him for some of the things that he said. I've faulted him for some of the things that he said and how he's proceeded. So yeah, they can, that's okay. You don't have to sort of write a person off entirely. I don't think that William Lane Craig is an idiot. And that he's dishonest in his beliefs. I just think he's not a good philosopher, because I think, as I said earlier, I think he's doing philosophy in reverse. There's no open-ended inquiry there. He thinks he's got the answers, and he's just trying to motivate people to believe the answers he thinks he's already got. But at least Lawrence Krauss, I don't think, is doing anything like that. He just has an opinion that is sort of really somewhat divorced from his field of expertise. And he's cashing in on his reputation and his prestige, and that's okay. I mean, if I was a super powerful and influential and famous thinker on some subject, and I had political beliefs, I'd be talking about my political beliefs and hoping that people would subscribe to my Twitter account and read my tweets and all that kind of stuff. Not that I have a Twitter account, but
well, I mean, this is interesting, because some of the things you've highlighted do to me illustrate a fundamental difference between philosophy and science in terms of academic journals and like. I mean, if you were a scientist and you made such a maverick view, either you would be considered someone like Einstein, that paradigm shifts the data to the extent that we come up with a new model and physics is revolutionized. That's one option. Another option is it's unfalsifiable in the case of something like string theory or M theory. It's still a contemptible theory, but it can't be empirically verified yet. It's just got mathematical consistency. And the only other option is that you're just wrong and you're proven to be wrong. Like, for instance, in the case of Fleischmann and Pons, who came up with the idea of cold fusion, and it wasn't a repeatable. It wasn't a reliable experiment, and it was found out that it didn't work, or in the case of the Valentine monopole, that sort of thing. And whereas William Lane Craig, I mean, if William Lane Craig was a scientist, what would happen would be other scientists would come along, show that he was wrong, and then that would be the end of it. But in the case of William Lane Craig, he's clearly wrong in some aspects of philosophy. I mean, empirically wrong. I mean, especially in the case of where he talks about relativity. I mean, I don't know whether any of you saw the Cowell versus Craig debates. where there was a debate between Cal and Craig about God or something, and Cal called Craig out on some of the physics that he got wrong. But in this case, if Craig was a scientist and studied science as opposed to philosophy, he would already be out of the community, I reckon, because he gets so much wrong. The field is you can't make so many mistakes and still get away with it. But in philosophy, it seems as if you can, and
That's ridiculous.
But you said that yourself. You don't think he's a bad philosopher. He just makes mistakes and comes to the wrong conclusions. But
I didn't say that. I did say he is a bad philosopher. I think he's a terrible philosopher. But his stuff on philosophy of time, I think, is probably just fine and rigorous for all I know. I'm not in a position to evaluate it. But his stuff on philosophy of religion, I think, is terrible. I think he's a terrible philosopher there. I think he's doing philosophy in reverse, which makes him a bad philosopher in that respect. To the extent that he's doing that, I think he is a bad philosopher. And I think he when he goes up against a well, I'll give you an example. He'll go up against someone like Sean Carroll, and he'll have it pointed out to him that he's getting some basic facts of physics wrong. Well, not basic facts, but actually more abstruse facts about physics and physical theories wrong. Now, well, when he does that, I mean, he's discredited himself. He does look ridiculous to people who are working in the field. I mean, there are philosophers of science in the field who are going to go, oh, geez, that was ridiculous. I can't believe, he's saying this kind of stuff. Right, but what do you want them to do? Tar and feather him? Like, that's not what goes on. People just say they don't take him seriously. The fact that there are people in philosophy of religion who don't know any more about this stuff than the average person does, and think, oh, he must be onto something. Well, so what? I mean, I don't see what is the point in disparaging the field. I mean, it seems odd to me what you're suggesting here. This is no different than if. I'll give you an example. I mean, I hear people talk about language all the time. I hear scientists say things about language, which, I mean, I have to rub my eyes in disbelief some of the things that I read when scientists talk about language, having studied nothing, read nothing about the field of linguistics, nothing about philosophy of language. People who go around with a sort of a naive, reference theory of meaning and stuff like that. I mean, there are things that get said by scientists all the time in books, and you think, how could you be, talking about this stuff, But it just goes, it just passes. This is not how these things work. When a person in a field says something that intrudes on another person's field, and they are not qualified enough to comment on it, they just marginalize themselves. They can have a constituency that admires them and ignores this. That can happen in any field. It happens in philosophy. It happens in the sciences. What happened with Pons and Fleischmann, though, was really quite different. These were not people that just had a sort of a marginal view and were behaving responsibly. These were people that had made a reckless set of claims. They feared that they were going to be scooped, so they went out and they did what they should not have done. Instead of sort of publishing their findings, they held a press conference to announce some fantastic breakthrough, and because they feared they were going to be scooped, they wanted to make sure that they were on top of all this and got ahead of it and made sure they get the credit. And then when people were not able to reproduce the findings and were insisting that, please give us the procedure, or we need to know the exact method you used, they were not forthcoming. They were playing hide the ball with their method because they knew they hadn't really sorted it out, and they didn't want to give it away and have someone else actually scoop them. And I mean, this is something you simply cannot do in the sciences. You cannot be secretive. You have to be open. You have to, when you make claims like this, you have to be able to support them. And that's why they discredited themselves. I mean, so I think that's quite a different case. This wasn't merely people who came to different theoretical conclusions on the basis of something. This was a kind of scientific fraud, not a very high order fraud. It wasn't sort of the complete manufacture of data. This wasn't like Andrew Wakefield or something like that. But it's still a species of intellectual deceit and scientific fraud, and that's a surefire way to discredit yourself. And I think William Lane Craig has in fact discredited himself to many philosophers. I mean, when I sort of became aware of him and started, asking my colleagues, what do you think of him? And they were like, oh, they would roll their eyes, oh, him, That's what goes on. But in another area where people don't know that he doesn't know what he's talking about in the area of physics, it just passes.
Well,
I think.
Sorry. Go on, Joyce.
I think at the basis of this is the misconception that the philosophy is that that activity that old men stroke their beards and think about stuff. I think if taking in consideration what Osmandius said is, I think exactly what he said, that he is discredited in the field of philosophy, but most people have this misconception that it's just a bunch of people sitting around thinking about stuff, and then that you can really dismiss a person like William Lane Craig.
Well, on certain subjects, I think he's discredited and he would be dismissed. Not on all subjects. I mean, he has apparently made, and I'm not qualified to comment on this stuff, but I mean, some of the stuff that he's done on philosophy of time is apparently, rigorous and well received, and so I think I don't think that it has to be one or the other. It seems to me it can be both, and it probably is both. That he is playing fast and loose on one subject, and quite rigorous in the other, because one has really little to do with the other.
I mean, so with the Pons and Fleischmann thing, I know that in that case it was data fraud, but in sort of other cases of fringe theories and such in science, which I suppose it's, you don't get that sort of stuff that often, but they would more be instantly rejected by a journal article, in a sense that you'd have to pass these strict procedures to even get into a journal article, unless you publish in open access journals, and you can actually see quite a lot of rubbish in open access journals. For instance, I found it was a non-peer-reviewed open access journal. I found a paper by Christopher Monckton. I don't know if you know who Christopher Monckton is.
No, I don't.
Well, he's a UKIP politician in the UK, politician for the UKIP party, and he's a staunch climate change denier. He believes that humans have nothing to do with climate change, and that it's all natural cycles, that sort of thing. He published a paper, if you can call it that, in an open access journal, where he was trying to show that clouds are the reason that, I think it was something like, it was trying to show that clouds are the reason that global warming is due to cycles or something, and that you can explain them by the reflection of the sunlight off clouds. It turned out he was completely wrong, and he was debunked by other scientists for dividing by 3 for absolutely no reason at all. He confused. Well, it is actually true. He just divided something by 3 for no reason. It turned out that he confused sensitivity with forcing, which is a very, very basic error. But anyway, the point out. Sorry, I think I've gone off on a tangent. But the point I was making is Christopher Monckton would have. Oh god, I'm probably going to end up with a DMCA now for mentioning Monckton, because he's notorious for doing things like this as well. He invited himself to a university in New Zealand, and the university refused to have him, and he wrote this long letter, this legal letter to the professors, claiming that he'd been discriminated against, and trying to force the university to give him loads of money and stuff. Anyway, it's ridiculous. But the point is, he would never have had a chance to publish something like this in a high impact or peer-reviewed journal. Of course, William Lane Craig does, and what I don't get is why don't the journals filter out these maverick ideas? I mean, I mean, in the sciences, you wouldn't get maverick ideas unless they were maverick in the sense that people could at least reply to them and show that they were wrong in the case of it. But in the case
that's
of
exactly what happened.
Well, so people actually did reply to William Lane Craig, and
yeah, they do. And once it's done, it's done, and that's why no one has to go chasing him. And I mean, he can publish in a journal, and people will respond, and the rest of the community looks on and goes, yeah, okay, I'd say that's pretty debunked, and there might be a few people who say, no, I think Craig was right on this, but there isn't sort of this flurry of people writing, arguing back and forth about William Lane Craig's work in these journals because he's not making the big splash, and I mean, I'm not sure what is missing here. I mean, there's one thing that's different about philosophy from the natural sciences, though, obviously, and that is, I mean, with philosophy, what you're trying to do is you're trying to start typically with the data that we have in hand, the facts as they appear to us, as delivered to us, however they're delivered to us by the latest science, among other things, and you try to work out what the implications of that are. And you try to figure out, what does that imply? What are the possibilities? You try to extrapolate from this and say, what could this imply? Where should we look next? That's what you do. But what you can't do in philosophy is really do a whole lot of experimentation. I mean, you can suggest experiments, and then people will carry out those experiments. Really, the kind of experiments you do in philosophy typically are what are called thought experiments. You just try to work out, what would happen. I mean, think of someone like Galileo. Okay, I mean, at the dawn of modern science, Galileo, he wasn't sort of, up on the Leaning Tower of Pisa dropping steel balls and and things like that. I mean, people imagine that he did all these experiments, and if you read about him, in fact, what he did was mostly thought experiments. He thought, well, supposing I take a ball of a certain mass, and I take another ball of equal volume and size, but of a different material, so it has a different density, and so it weighs less, and I drop them at the same time. What would happen? And he thought, okay, well, let's assume that the Aristotelian model is correct, that the heavier thing will fall faster than the lighter thing and hit the ground first. And he reasoned, okay, all right, well, let's say that they were going to fall at different rates, one faster than the other, the heavier falling faster. What would happen if you were, while they were falling, chain them together, just link them together somehow? What would happen? Would the heavy one pull the lighter one down so that the lighter one would have to keep up with the fast one? Or would the lighter one slow down, act as drag on the heavier one and cause the heavier one to slow down? Or should you sum the masses of the two of them and imagine that it's now one object falling even faster? And you realize this is all bloody incoherent. This peripatetic, scholastic, Aristotelian model, it's got to be wrong. It doesn't make sense. He mostly reasoned this out. He didn't have to, I mean, he did in fact roll balls down inclined planes and measure rates and stuff like that. But sort of the idea of two falling bodies and stuff like that, I mean, that was all done in his head. It was a thought experiment. He was doing philosophy. And really, that's the kind of thing that goes on in philosophy. You look at what the data are, and you consider what the theory says, and then you go, all right, what can we work out from that? It is really just an extension of science, but because philosophers are dealing with questions where we're not in a position yet to answer these questions. We can't do the experiments. They can't just readily find out, oh, well, that's wrong. We need to abandon that theory. That's something that has to come in the fullness of time. It's usually done by people working in a specific discipline. So, I mean, philosophy can't be self-correcting in that sense, except over sort of the long term, which is why you don't have people, going around saying, oh, I'm a Baconian, or I'm a Cartesian, or I'm an Augustinian. It doesn't work that way. There's, if you look at, contemporary analytic philosophy, everyone is sort of, on the cutting edge. Nobody is one of these guys from antiquity and wholly subscribing to the philosophy of some person from a bygone age. That it doesn't work that way. It's more like science in that it moves along. There are advances in the field, but what there isn't is sort of the definitive way of demonstrating that a theory is incorrect, because a philosophical theory is not a theory that immediately admits of empirical refutation in most cases. Only rarely does a theory, a philosophical theory or conjecture admit of an empirical implication that is easily open to demonstration and falsification. And when that happens, it gets falsified and the field moves on. So, I mean, philosophy is really thinking at the sort of the margins of what we know and trying to extrapolate beyond that, and consequently, you can't just sort of easily falsify it. So there is that problem, there is that difficulty that you can't just sort of marginalize someone as mistaken as holding to a mistake, because the questions really are open. One of the things that happens in philosophy is you bracket things. You say, okay, let's assume this is true. Okay, now what would happen if this were true? What would happen if this were true? And William Lane Craig is kind of is someone who's saying, let's imagine the God of Christianity is true. What follows from that? What follows for morality? What follows for the origin of the universe? And he's really just, one way to think about him is he's trying to reconcile his theology, which is just a set of beliefs, background beliefs, with what we know about the world, and he's trying to make them make sense. And this is all to the good. Everyone should try to do that who is religious. They should try to reconcile these things. And hopefully, in the process, they will be willing to modify their theology in light of the facts, not just try to, confect an argument to reconcile them and doggedly insist on the theological beliefs come hell or high water, which is unfortunately where I think William Lane Craig goes really wrong. By the way, I know I'm someone who prattles on really long, so please feel free to interrupt me when I do.
Yes, it's been really quiet this week. I'm not really sure why, because weirdly there's been more people responding to the request than any other week. But last week there was more than 10 people in at one point, and it was getting really quite chaotic. So it's difficult to anticipate what's going to happen each week. So I mean, I was expecting quite a busy week this week, but it's surprising, because some weeks you get a busy week, some weeks it seems to be quiet. Anyway, I did actually have one question for you that I thought about this. If a philosopher, in the sense of metaphysics, requires the physics before they can do the interesting interpretative work on physics, I guess that's. Am I saying that right, or?
Yeah, no, that's a fair characterization.
So, if that's the case, then that requires you to learn the cosmology and the physics first. So, and actually, this question can actually apply to science as well as it can apply to philosophy. In the future, we're going to continue to learn more and more stuff, and that basically means that the physics we're going to learn is harder, because the maths that we're using to describe it is going to become more difficult. The differential equations are going to get more complicated. I mean, if we solve the Schrödinger equation for an atom other than hydrogen, the solution is going to be quite difficult to understand. It's going to get harder and harder and harder for us to be able to describe the models of our universe, as it has done. I mean, before Einstein came along, the classical physics was relatively straightforward, and you could be basically an expert. Well, maybe not in the 1920s, but before Newton's time, you could basically be an expert on absolutely everything. You could understand chemistry, thermodynamics, physics, philosophy, all to a decent extent, and you could basically come up with new ideas all the time. But these days, if you want to be a successful physicist or scientist, or I suppose by extension philosopher, you have to understand all these ideas, which takes at least a decade of education before you can start producing your own output. So my worry is that it's going to take longer and longer for us to get to that stage. The education period is going to take longer. So it's 10 years now. What if it's 20 years in the future, because these concepts are harder and harder? And I'm worried that eventually we'll get to the stage where the time it takes to learn all this stuff is longer than the human lifespan. And is that going to be a limit to the amount of stuff that we can learn, when the time it takes to even understand the stuff is longer than the average time a human takes to live? And so humans can't progress or understand any more about the universe because they simply don't live for long enough.
Yeah, that seems to me to be entirely plausible. I mean, the age of the Renaissance man or woman is long, long past. I mean, there was a time when you really could be. There was literally a time in the late Middle Ages where you could have read every great book that had been written. You could live long enough to have read every great work that was still extant. But now that's long gone. And I mean, anybody in any field of research is hard pressed to just keep abreast of what is being published in their field, on a monthly basis. You have to struggle to keep abreast of that. So yeah, I think that it takes longer and longer, and that's why you get hyper specialization. That's why people specialize. I mean, when I was working on my master's thesis, the fellow who was supervising me said, you know, we have to find a committee. We got to throw a committee together who are going to oversee your thesis and before whom you will sit and defend your thesis. And you know, we were trying to come up with names of people, and you know, there wasn't as much internet communication back then. So it sort of mostly meant actually people physically coming together, and this was difficult because there was perhaps a dozen people in the world who were qualified to oversee the research that I was doing and the thesis that I was going to be writing. You know, that's how specialized it can get. You know, that, you know, there'll be lots of people who will understand what I'm writing, but there won't be enough people who are really qualified to oversee my thesis, right? And it's not because I was brilliant. It's just because I was writing on a very, very narrow subject, and that's what happens. The more the fields grow and grow, and the more you have to sort of sink your teeth into something narrow, you can't possibly keep abreast of the entire field. And that's one of the advantages of philosophy, actually, is, you know, philosophers have a tendency to sort of try to look at the big intellectual picture. That's one of the things that goes on, and there have always been not just philosophers, but people in the sciences and in the humanities in general who make it their responsibility to be generalists, to sort of keep track of the big picture. So if nothing else, to at least be able to popularize these ideas and get them out there so that people can understand what's going on, so we don't lose sight of things. But yeah, it seems to me that the human lifetime and the amount of time it takes to learn a subject well enough and in depth enough to master it and be able to make a meaningful contribution, that human lifetime is going to act as ultimately as a brake on that, and then that'll be as far as we can go. You can actually lose sight of the big picture. Yeah, it seems to me that's entirely possible. And with this fragmentation of knowledge is a real problem. We already have this now. You have branches of science, and we see a lot of this in the social sciences, where people are employing one theory and they're making good progress using this theory, applying a certain theory, and then there are people next door in another department working on another theory and they're making good progress, and they don't realize that these theories they're incompatible. One of them has to be wrong, but they're all going off in their separate directions. In principle, there's no reconciling these things because these theories make incompatible claims. They have different foundational assumptions, and they're irreconcilable. They are incommensurable models, as we say in the philosophy of science. And something's got to give. But instrumentally, they work. They're fine. So we just keep going with them and keep going with them. But it's possible to not even know that the person next door, who's generating results, who you find useful for your theory, you don't realize that they generated those results using a model that is incompatible and incommensurable with your own model. So it's possible to have a picture of reality that works, but that isn't one picture of reality, but is 50,000 different inconsistent, incommensurable pictures of reality. It's like trying to make a jigsaw puzzle out of pieces drawn from different boxes of different jigsaw puzzles and trying to make them fit. That's another possibility. That's one of the sort of the concerns, that if there isn't a synthetic, there isn't anyone trying to do the synthetic work of trying to synthesize, of bringing it all together at a deep conceptual level, it's possible that we will have an absolutely incoherent worldview. But each specific theory works as far as it goes. That's possible. I think likely, in fact.
Would you say that there was an intelligent limit, an intelligence limit as well? And I suppose this is another side to the coin, as well as the human lifespan acting as a brake. If we end up with theories that become increasingly complicated, as they are, Newtonian, I can explain basically the whole of Newtonian mathematics on the back of a postcard, and I suspect that all of you will be able to understand it. Whereas with general relativity in terms of gravity, not even could I not explain it, but if I could, then it would be several books worth. So clearly things are becoming more complicated and difficult to understand, and you only get geniuses that come along every so often. So what happens if the gradient of the climb in understanding is more than the amount of geniuses that we get in order to be able to understand this? We get to a state where that's also stopping our progress. The human lifespan is stopping our progress. We have perhaps, I mean, you said that the idea of this jigsaw type analogy doesn't really seem to be happening in the sciences as of yet, even though it might be happening in philosophy. But this could certainly start to happen, and we end up in a. I mean, of course, if science starts to stagnate, then it's not going to be long until technology does. So we could end up with a technologically stagnant society. I mean, that would be quite interesting. What would a society be like that doesn't develop technologically? Would a stagnating civilization be disastrous? If any of you have ever read Asimov's book, Asimov's book series, I'm trying to remember which one it was. It was the one about the
Foundations.
Yes, Foundations. That's it. They had the Spacers had a technologically stagnant world. I think it was called Aurora, and the consequences of technological stagnance were absolutely devastating for the world. It ended up collapsing in the end, I think. Whereas the humans, the terrestrial humans, had a technologically expanding world, and they seemed to do better out of it. It was interesting how Asimov projected it would happen, sort of like a cyclical process. But it seems a really scary thing that we could end up at a point, maybe in the distant future, where humans completely stop changing, in the sense our technology stops growing. I mean, in that sense, if we can't understand science, would humans give up even bothering to understand it? Would we stop learning science? Will we just become contented enough to understand how our technology operates? Will we even lose that eventually? Will we literally go back to the Stone Age and then climb up the ladder again from that perspective? I mean, this is all assuming, of course, that we don't wipe ourselves out before then. But
well, I think an interesting assumption that there's always progress, which is only correct essentially in the last 150 years of human civilization. Before that, it was very slow progress, but still, every so a couple of 100 years, disasters might happen. We get set back a long time. The Egyptians, the Romans, during the Black Plague. I mean, it's essential to human civilization for the most of the time that progress is not constant, and I don't know if you can keep up with the speed which you are doing it currently. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. I obviously, if look, the universe wasn't built for us. I don't believe that there's a God that created a universe, and therefore he created it in such a way that it is, in principle, fully comprehensible to us. It's entirely possible, in fact, maybe even likely, that the universe is queerer than we can imagine, queerer than we can understand. It's possible that it would simply never be perfectly intelligible to us, that there will always be questions that we just simply can't understand because our minds can't make sense of the way the universe works. That's entirely possible. And people will say, well, but that's never been the case. We've always been able to. Well, yeah, of course. As long you're always able to understand, so long as you're able to understand. And then when you reach the point where you can't, for all we know, we're asking questions now that we will never understand. That's entirely possible, right? And then it's, we would hope maybe that we will be able to construct artificial intelligences that will be able to sort of do the heavy lifting where our reasoning capacities fail. Maybe we can outsource our capacity for intellectual advancement to bigger brains, right? Or maybe we can, get these into our heads somehow and augment our cognitive capacities. And if we could do that, that would be great too. But what's funny about the idea of progress is that the idea of progress is itself an innovation. Societies always change; they always evolve, but that's not the same as progress. Progress is a really weird idea. It's this idea of improvement. We're learning more, and we're getting better, and we're advancing, and there's material advancement, and there's a kind of moral improvement that comes with that. And you just have to look at sort of the Christian Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, where we just lost so much learning, where there was a sense of fatalism, of you know, everything that is important to know is already known. It's been delivered to us through this religious revelation, and you can just, you know, you can just sponge out and erase, you know, Euclid's geometry so that you can write another sermon on it. You know, we actually did this. Palimpsest. We let fantastic works from antiquity rot away. We overwrote them so that we could write sermons and prayers and you know, theological works and stuff like that, because it was thought really material improvement doesn't matter. And it took really until the Renaissance for people to sort of think, no, we can move forward. It's a really weird idea. It's a recent idea in human history, and we're addicted to it. I mean, we are addicted to progress. We love the idea of progress. We will adopt and embrace a technology without considering for a moment the downside. We just, you know, anybody puts out a new technology or a new a new product, you know, and we're ready to embrace it. We are technophiles. We just are uncritical worshippers of progress, and we assume that it will always be to the better, and that is a kind of social experiment that we don't know the outcome of. We'll find out. Maybe it could be terrible, but I don't think that societies will sort of stagnate in the sense that they will stop changing. They'll always be changing and evolving, but they can stop progressing. And one of the things that could act as a brake is an inability to make any progress in our theories. We just can't get anywhere. Our models have delivered everything that they're going to deliver if that day comes, and then we're stuck, and then we give up, and then we just sort of start coasting on the knowledge that we have. And it's possible to unlearn stuff. I mean, you know, the ancient Romans had concrete. They were building multi-story buildings out of concrete. We lost that until practically the late, you know, 1800s, early 1900s, till when we rediscovered concrete. You know, we weren't able to build multi-story buildings, you know, except by doing it like the pyramids with one block on top of another. You know, but you know, the Romans had surpassed that. You know, millennia before that, before we rediscovered how to make concrete. So yeah, you can unlearn stuff, you can lose stuff, you can go back, and hopefully it's there to be rediscovered. But yeah, I guess it is a little worrisome. I don't anticipate we're anywhere near that point, though. I think that our scientific knowledge is in its infancy still.
Well, we also want to consider that we, and by we I mean humans, are, as far as IQ is concerned, we're apparently getting smarter. I watched a TED Talk not too long ago. I can't recall, but basically the TED Talk was explaining the reason that we seem to be, you know, smarter than our grandparents and great-grandparents and so on. And a big part of the reason for that is our having developed an ability to actually think more in abstract. So we're better able to consider abstract principles, whereas, you know, a farmer in the 1800s would only consider things that he can actually see and touch, and that's all that matters. And thus just couldn't think in that term. And even in the 60s, I think, that's when, you know, the kids white kids having gone off to college, you know, and seeing the struggles that for civil rights that black people were going through at the time, and coming home and going, well, Dad, what if you woke up tomorrow and you were black? And Dad's going, but I'm not going to. That doesn't matter. It's not a thing. That can't happen. And it's because of that inability to think in the abstract. And so we're apparently getting smarter, and I think as we get smarter, we're able to absorb more knowledge faster. And so I don't see it ever coming to a point wherein we're going to not be able to learn enough to progress. I think we're going to be starting earlier, learning more, and the technology and books, information we have so easily accessible, they didn't have that. You know, like centuries past, you didn't have that. We didn't have the internet. Just decades ago, we didn't have the internet when I was born. Not mass distributed anyway. I think it had been invented.
That's a really interesting point, actually. We have intellectual tools that we come up with, right? I mean, mathematics is the most striking example, right? I mean, there was a time when people didn't even have geometry, but sometime around the pre-Socratics, they came up with geometry, and that was revolutionary, and it took a long time for mathematics to sort of come into its own. I mean, we have mathematics now that literally, I mean, we have 9-year-olds that could outperform mathematicians from the Middle Ages, right? Just the fact. I mean, here's a technology. Never mind mathematics, like arithmetic and algebra. Just the fact that we have Arabic numerals, and that we're and a base 10 system and a positional system means that we can do division so much more easily than ancient Romans and Greeks could because of their notation. Their notation made it hard to do long division. It made it hard to do long division. A 9-year-old can outperform almost any mathematician from the ancient world when it comes to division, and it's because we invented a technology, a way of representing, of describing a certain mathematical operation. And that's to say nothing of the fact that we came up with something like mathematics to begin with. And look how we've sort of leveraged ourselves. We just catapulted ourselves forward with that. And there's what's to say that we can't come up with something, an intellectual tool, as unimaginably powerful as mathematics has been in the future, right? I mean, we could come up to, starting tomorrow, we could start coming up with some intellectual tool.
Some kind of osmosis machine.
Well, yeah, I mean,
like information dump. I'm thinking Stargate, but
yeah,
like info dump in your
head. Technology. I'm not even thinking of a technology. I'm thinking just like a tool, just like an intellectual tool. I mean, here's another one. Just think of the advancements we've made because of logic, or the idea of an experiment, that an experiment isn't just looking for proof, but an experiment is putting a hypothesis to the test and exposing it to falsification. The self-conscious realization that that is what an experiment is helped advance science. I mean, scientists used to waste time on terrible experiments, just horribly designed, because they didn't understand that falsification was an important ingredient in experimental design, and that really introduced rigor to scientific efforts. But something like math is amazing, right? How much we can do because of math. The idea of measuring things. I mean, it took until Galileo to say, maybe we should measure how long it takes for something to happen, right? And that this is a different. We need to carve off time from space. I mean, this is a weird thing that happened, but when it happened, it was fantastic. The idea of maybe we should measure things, maybe we should weigh things, maybe where it was mined doesn't matter, maybe who owned it, right, and the status of its owner isn't an important attribute in why it behaves the way it does. But I mean, prior to Galileo, people had weird ideas. Why does this behave like this? Oh, it's because this belonged to someone wealthy. What? How could people have thought these things? But these were all hard-won intellectual advancements, and tools like mathematics completely transformed us, created opportunities to explain things that were inexplicable without them. You simply could not generate certain models of reality that we now have in hand without mathematics. And it's possible that we will come up with some intellectual tool in the future that is like mathematics, not similar to mathematics, could be utterly unlike mathematics, but is like mathematics in what it can do for us. And then it could catapult us so that now, people will look at relativity and the queerness of quantum phenomena and those kinds of unbelievably complicated equations and think, this is kid stuff. This is nothing. That's not impossible.
Or even in terms, you're thinking in terms of like a means of learning, essentially, or applying knowledge, or.
Well, I'm thinking of try to imagine.
I keep thinking of like flashcards, like in terms of a not as opposed to a technological learn stuff faster,
Okay, well,
that seems to be the quandary we might eventually face, is the amount of time required to learn things being too much. Then we would need a way to learn faster, and so it makes me think more of flashcards than math.
Well, think of something. I'm not thinking of a technology. I'm thinking of an intellectual technology. I mean, think of charts and graphs. Okay, we are actually very good at charts and graphs. You know, most people who are educated nowadays can look at charts and graphs and glean some information with only a little bit of education. Okay, but generations ago, charts and graphs were not to be found. You really almost never found them in books, right? This is a kind of technology, an intellectual technology. It's a way of representing relationships visually. You're exploiting your visual hardware to help you understand very abstract relationships. So charts and graphs and histograms and things like that, even something as simple as a pie chart, right, is something that lets you understand a relationship between quantities and objects and events that you wouldn't be able to do without, or with only extreme difficulty. And without those things, there'd be tremendous breaks on what we can understand. But I mean, mathematics to me seems like the most striking thing. I mean, you know, where would we be in our science if we didn't have mathematics? Imagine if we had never done it. Imagine if we'd never developed algebra. You know, where would we be? Well, I don't know where we would be. I don't know what the state of our knowledge would be, but it would be nothing like what it is. And it's possible that someday we will invent some new intellectual tool that is as formidable in what it can offer us as math proved to be to our ancestors. You know, we're just lucky we were born here. I mean, it's hard enough to understand math. Inventing math is amazing. How people invent math is just fascinating, that we can do it at all. But once it's there, however hard it was to come up with algebra and come up with the calculus, now people can just understand the calculus. They can learn it. It's hard to learn calculus, but you can do it. But it's possible that someday we will come up with some new tool that isn't math, but is as powerful in its capacity to help us understand difficult things that we simply could not understand without it. That could happen. So yeah, I'm not pessimistic about where the limit of where our epistemic limit ultimately lies on what we can know and whether progress is going to be limited. I don't think all bets are off in my view.
Well, you touched an interesting topic for me is about forgetting information. I think it's a lot more difficult to as a society to forget certain ideas now with the internet without, you know, catastrophic disasters like a nuclear war or something. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. If you can forget, if we can as a society choose to forget something, like atomic bombs or something, if that's even possible.
I don't know of any culture that's ever uninvented a technology that it's developed and found useful. But you can forget. There can be a catastrophe. I mean, when you think about what happened with the Library of Alexandria and the destruction of that, the loss of knowledge of the ancient world there is incalculable. I cry almost when I think about what we lost there. So that could happen. I mean, we could wreck our civilization with, you know, weaponry or just environmental degradation that could just send us into a terrible tailspin or something like that. All that has to happen is our population numbers drop significantly, and you know, we're practically back into the Stone Age.
Well, there's something that could happen overnight that could cause that to happen. I mean, we could have a solar flare large enough, or a solar mass ejection, that would cripple electronics, you know, on this planet to a point where we couldn't navigate streets because our streetlights don't work, or you know, we couldn't call someone on a cell phone, and most people nowadays, that's what they use as their primary communications device, or have a hangout here, as we're doing now.
Well, that would be an interesting world, wouldn't it? Because somewhere like North Korea would do pretty well out of that, I would have thought.
Yes, but you know, this is something that could happen today. I mean, it could happen. When was the last time? It was back in the early '90s. There was I believe it was it a mass ejection or just a solar flare? I don't remember, but the beepers or pagers that people were using across the world stopped working, and that's a perfect example. Now imagine on a much larger scale, what would happen right now to the information flow in this world.
Yeah, none of your computers work. Just imagine the sort of the data loss, if things get fried or something like that, or right, something
Most
like
cars.
that. Yeah, most cars. Yeah, there's an electromagnetic pulse. You can't even get a vehicle to start.
But that's kind of the point. What the thing that would make us forget or information we have now is something of such magnitude that would almost certainly destroy mankind after that. I mean, if total destruction of our electronics, I think mass starvation, I think it might be the end of humanity in some places around the world. But
yeah, my sense is that if you have a sufficiently bad catastrophe, something smacks into the earth and a huge meteoritic collision or something like that devastates the planet and damages the environment to such a degree that certain critical species disappear, agriculture becomes almost impossible. Who knows how many of us would survive in a nightmare scenario like that? But how many of us in the modern world have even the necessary skills to find food for ourselves? Most people don't know how to hunt and fish, and grow food and make shelter and make clothing. We are so dependent. We are interdependent to such a degree that nobody knows really how to do anything anymore.
Alaskans are actually pretty good about self-sufficiency and stuff. That's why I like living here. There's lots and lots of hunting and fishing and whatnot. Like, we get gifted with meat from various animals every now and again. It's just like, oh, here, we killed a moose and we don't need the whole thing, have a roast. We caught a whole bunch of fish, and here, now my freezer's full of salmon, like, exploding with salmon. This happens. But I think in that situation, that's why I keep this one around. He's very handy.
Well, people in primitive cultures would have an enormous advantage, of course, because they would still have in their heads, they'd still be carrying around the knowledge necessary to do what's necessary for what we would consider presently a primitive level of survival. So they would have a huge advantage. But yeah, if our numbers fall to that point and everyone is now sort of bent on surviving, the last thing that you care about is physics, electronics, electronic communication. Your priorities change, right? All of this that we've produced, all of this philosophy, all of this great literature, great art, and science, and modeling reality at these extreme levels of abstraction and generality and extraordinary precision, that all requires an enormous amount of leisure. You really have to have people you have to have a society, an entire civilization that says, yeah, we're gonna have a society that has so much leisure, and that we can have people so hyper specialized that all they have to do is go into a laboratory and devote years of their life to studying this. They don't have to worry about producing any food or clothing for themselves. All the sort of material means of for material life and stuff like that. This will all be taken care of by other means through other specialists and stuff like that. We don't realize how tenuous all this is. How it would only take one big catastrophe and it all goes. And we're not just going to relearn it. Once it's gone, boy, it's going to be gone. We're going to have to relearn it the hard way.
I think I'll just point out that what John was referring to was a coronal mass ejection, and the biggest one I think was in the mid 1800s, and it was called the Carrington event, and there was aurora visible as far south as the Tropic of Cancer, and I mean the aurora was so bright you could read by it, and it was actually a fairly amusing conversation between some telegraph operators that their telegraph ceased to work because the solar flare was so strong, but they could still operate the telegraphs just by modulating the signals without using the batteries, because you could just use the auroral current. I mean, they said, I think the operator said something like, please cut off your battery entirely from the line in 15 minutes. Will do so, it is now disconnected. Mine is also disconnected and we're working with the auroral current. How do you see my writing? Better than with our batteries on. I mean, it was quite amusing, but it's something that if it happened today, I very much doubt we would be amused by it. I mean, it would be pretty devastating. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it would only affect one half of the planet, of course. So I don't know what would the impact be. I mean, it would be huge. And also the thing about this is that it's not like an asteroid, a meteor event that we could at least have some capability of predicting. But this is something that literally could happen. Well, actually, it won't happen tomorrow because the sun's in a really calm phase at the moment. But it's something that is going to happen at some point, and we've got to be prepared for it. You sort of question why people aren't putting more money towards this sort of thing, and putting up. I mean, because we do have the technology, I think, to at least give us some sort of warning, and there are some potential measures that we could take. I just guess that we don't put as much priority towards it as we perhaps should do. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting all the things that you were saying. I mean, I would be interested to know which countries would prosper out of an event like this. I mean, would Africa, would some of the African countries do quite well? I mean, some of the dictatorships in Africa, or maybe even somewhere like North Korea, which, I mean, North Korea certainly doesn't particularly rely on electricity. I mean, they don't really have much electricity in North Korea, do they? Kim Jong-un probably does, but
No, only in Pyongyang.
Yeah. If you look at the satellite, maps of North Korea, it looks like the sea. It's so dark. But it's an interesting idea. One question I'd be interested to ask you all is: are you all optimists? Are you all sort of like envisioned a sort of Star Trek type civilization, or are you optimists or pessimists or apathetic towards the question? I'd be interested to know.
I think I'm an optimist, but it's more about the presuppositions of my generation. I think with all we have ever known is progress, exponential progress, and I don't know if it will ever keep up. But yeah, I think I'm rather optimistic about the future, but we'll see.
Yeah, so am I. I'm with Joris. I have no rational reason for my optimism, but it's because I grew up on shows like Star Trek and stuff like that. That just my disposition, my temperament is one of optimism and sort of forward thinking and imagining a rosier future. It just seems to me that the story, at least since the Renaissance, has been one of not just material improvement and progress, but moral improvement and progress. The emancipation of women, the emancipation of certain disadvantaged groups and races and things like that. Yeah, it just seems to me that we have come so far that throwing off the shackles of superstition and religious thought. These have all been to the good, not entirely without some social bad social consequences. But I mean, on the whole, it's been moving in a direction that I think is wonderful, and I sort of can't help feeling, but I know there's no basis for this. That it's like there's a trend. It's like history has a direction and there's a flow. And I know that that's completely irrational, but that's how it feels to me. And so yeah, I am by disposition optimistic, but I really have no. And the other side of me is, well, look, I know every species is going to go extinct, so so will we. And I just hope it doesn't happen suddenly and catastrophically and soon.
Yeah, I'm optimistic up until even through a, like, say, coronal mass ejection global catastrophe situation. I think because the information that we have is so very scattered, both in hard copy and on computers and whatnot, I don't think we're really at risk of losing what we've learned, losing the people who are capable of using it, yes, but I think we would get them back eventually. But I'm very much an optimist future-wise in general, up to the point where we all die, because it'll happen.
Actually, what you brought up a really interesting memory that I have actually about reading an article about technology proceeding. Oh, shut up, Facebook! Just close that. It's really pissing me off. Sorry. I read a really interesting science article a few months ago about something like this, and it was that there are dangers associated with too rapid progress. And one problem that people were having was the amount of entertainment and information stored on video cassette tapes is fairly huge. and there's a load of classic programs that literally are still on the VHS cassette tapes and are not on a digital format. And what people are trying to do is convert the VHSs to a more storable format like a DVD. Because VHS cassettes do have a finite lifespan, they do corrode, and eventually the data can be lost off them. So, but one of the big problems with this is that the technology for VHS cassette tapes isn't singular. There were so many different cassette players and so many different technologies. I mean, I'm talking from the point of view right back into the 50s, 60s, and so on. There's so many different players, so many different types of media, that people don't even know how to read these tapes anymore. This is literally true, that there were tapes that from a few decades ago that we can't even read anymore because we don't. I think there's like treasure hunts for like players that people are looking for in order to play these tapes before we lose the ability to be able to use them, and it's quite staggering, really. I mean, I can imagine that if something like this happens. The idea is that we lose the ability to use our own technology, and then the technology in the meantime starts to degrade. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you would worry about from this point of view. And also, some of the things I'm worried about is that as our technology gets better, I suppose the stakes get higher. I mean, we have nuclear weapons now. It doesn't take much of a mistake in order for everything to go wrong. And we've also got cyber warfare to look forward to. I mean, that's not something big at the moment, but I suspect in 50 years' time, the new form of warfare will be cyber warfare, and we'll be fighting over information rather than in the traditional sense.
For me, the sort of the basis of any pessimism in connection with a natural disaster like that, like a solar flare or mass ejection or something like that, has to do with how societies would respond. I mean, this is going to affect one hemisphere. You're going to have another hemisphere that's going to be virtually unaffected by it. Well, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be a sudden imbalance of power, right? People are not going to just say, oh, well, we're just going to sit back and let the United States or the UK or whatever just we're going to give them whatever assistance and time they need. I mean, there are powerful political forces at work all the time, ready to exploit any advantage, and you can bet that when something like this happens, people will step in and try to take advantage of catastrophic misfortune of other people, perhaps even in the name of trying to help them. So, I mean, something like this happens, I think the lines on the map are going to get completely redrawn, I see sort of the potential for massive warfare and that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing that I think could just be absolutely disastrous. And when that kind of thing happens, and people are preoccupied with that, no one's trying to sort of, oh, we need to recoup the knowledge. Everyone's just trying to survive, stay alive, kill their enemy, stay safe from their enemies. And when that kind of thing happens, you can sort of descend into mad world, potentially. It could get that bad, and then, well, good luck, trying to, resuscitate all the old knowledge, like you said, this technology has a life, it has a shelf life, it goes bad. We think books are quaint technology, but, books had were like a 500-year success story. The idea of a book, of a librum, pages between a cover, those, we still find old books, and they're still readable. As long as you can read the language, you can still read these old books. It's amazing, but I mean, Rose held up, what is it, a 3.5-inch floppy disk, and I mean, I don't own a piece of technology that could read that. And if you show me a 5.25-inch floppy disk, good luck finding technology that'll still play that. Most people don't have any of that around. So the more, the more this stuff it rests on in media that cannot just be looked at and read, but requires an electronic, complicated medium in which it's instantiated to make it work and come alive on a screen for you. It's like, man, that's really things fall apart fast if too much of our knowledge is embedded in that.
Well, Elsie, I think you gave me a wonderful segue into a topic which is conjoined with this one. It's a question: is there anything any of you would be willing to start World War III over? And I mean everything, nuclear war, everything.
I'm sorry. Was there a question to me there? I was answering a comment in the questions, and I wasn't hearing you. I apologize, yours.
Well, this is in relation to the Ukraine situation and NATO. And the question is there anything any of us would be willing to start World War III over? And all out nuclear war, etc.
Me?
Yeah,
no.
Yeah. For example,
no.
You.
No.
No here as well.
Because, well, I listened to a podcast by a guy named Dan Carlin, and he made a point that there's a question that has already been answered for us, for U.S. citizens and Western European people. That's because NATO has a regulation that's Article 5, which means that any breach of the national border of a country that's joined with NATO must be seen as a breach of the own national border. So, and countries which have this protection are Romania, Latvia, nearly Ukraine, and you have people in America right now and in Europe, and they keep throwing verbal abuse at Russia and threatening them, whilst this might well lead to a world war if you're not careful with these kinds of laws.
Yeah, that's very worrisome. It seems to me that the only way we're going to avoid that kind of thing is if we really don't take such laws seriously, and we can only hope that people don't take such laws seriously when these events arise of incredible international tensions. We just have to hope that people don't want to stick hard to the rules and guidelines that they've written. But part of the reason we write rules like this into international laws and these treaties and these pacts is precisely as deterrence. You have to sort of always pretend that if there's going to be an incredible deterrence, you have to at least pretend that you're prepared to go to war. Paradoxically, the pretense that you're ready to go to war is in fact a deterrent of war.
Yeah, but that's kind of the point. What we're saying as NATO is we're willing to start World War III over the national security of Latvia, and I think that's fine as a deterrent if that's at least a topic where anybody discusses in politics, but nobody nobody does that in America or Europe, and yet we're having situations like in Georgia and in Ukraine, which could well lead to such dangerous situations.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have anything valuable to add to this subject. It's too complicated and frankly terrifying to think about. I really don't like to think about these kinds of situations. These questions. These are problems that have so many moving parts, and you just need to know so much about international law and stuff like that I feel completely ill-equipped to even speculate on these things, as important as they are.
But have we reached a natural stopping point then? Would we say?
Yeah, but can I ask one quick question?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, this really has nothing to do with any of the topics we've talked about here tonight. But I did a burning question in my mind, and I just want to float it publicly here and see if I'm just crazy or if it's just me. But since this whole airplane disappearance with Malaysian flight from Malaysia to where was it, Beijing, I think. Since that disappearance of that plane, it struck me that in the 12.5 years since 9/11, we've come up with no technology to pinpoint the movements of something as huge as a 747 or 777 actually across the world, and we can't even begin to say where this thing went. Does anyone else find that a little strange, or just a huge oversight?
Well, on the one point, it's kind of scary that, you know, hijacking of 777s can still happen, and they might still disappear. Like this one, I don't know if it's hijacked or not, but that doesn't really the point. But yeah, on the other side, I'm kind of relieved with you know, the NSA business and privacy. But yeah, I think it's interesting. It's kind of shows us we're still limited, more limited than we might think.
Well, I found it a little strange in this day and age with all the technology we have. We can pinpoint where your mother-in-law is probably right now using GPS and triangulation and what have you, but we can't find a 777. It's just crazy. Anyway, that was my question. I'm done.
Would everyone agree that this is an actual stopping point then?
Sure.
Sure. Does anyone else have any last concluding points to make before we stop with? So brief concluding points. I was in a hangout last night where they were talking about a theist that went on for 7.5 minutes, so it's maybe not that. But does anyone have anything brief to conclude with? And then we'll end it. Okay. Okay. If not, then thanks everyone for coming along to this. We'll do it again in 2 weeks. To anyone that's watching, I would prefer if people called in earlier, because what seems to happen is that the activity seems to go up through the thing, and it's quite difficult to start off with few people. So if anyone would prefer a different time, perhaps an hour later, although I would say that in Britain the clocks are going forward or backwards. Well, the clocks are changing. I don't know which way. I'm tired. I haven't had much sleep, but the clocks are changing in some way in Britain soon, which means that in Magic Sandwich Show is going to be an hour later anyway. So this show is probably going to be an hour later in a few weeks, whenever the clocks go forward or back in the UK. So I think that's about everything. I can't think of anything else to say. Oh yes. The time is 8 p.m. with GMT, which equates to, I think, 3 p.m. EST. And the next time we'll be doing this will be in 2 weeks' time. I think that's everything. Oh, thanks everyone for coming there. Goodbye. Oops, I pressed my mute button instead of stop broadcast.